All right, I'm going to start with another story about another little community in Indiana. When I tell it in other places, they're like, really, it's not like that there. And I get to tell both of them here to you. How many of you now know where Kurtz is? Ha, I got you on one. Look it up on your Google Maps, Kurtz, Indiana. I think Morton is the next town that actually appears on a map closest to it. If you Google the towns next to it, Kurtz doesn't even show up. It only shows up if you actually put the name Kurtz in, because it's not a town that actually exists like in the survey. But Kurtz, Indiana. And several years ago, I was doing a conference sponsored by Lilly, actually, Lilly Foundation, doing some ministry things. And so I came in, and Kurtz happened to be central to that region of the state where pastors were coming from, so we did it there. And I drove there, and again, it was a mile after mile after mile with nothing. And then there's this wide spot on the road with a handful of houses and this one little church, Kurtz Nazarene Church. And I drove up. And have you ever been to a church where it's kind of rough, but there's the rough of neglect and there's the rough of activity? This was like it was scuffed on the edges, but it was from current activity. I thought, okay, a little tiny church, but something's happening here. Cool. We did the conference like this. And at the end of it, I went to the pastor and said, hey, give me the tour. It didn't take long. And at the end of the tour, standing in his office, and I said, this may be a silly question from a big city guy, but this feels like a really active church. He goes, oh yeah, it really is. I go, how? There's nobody here. Is the town on the other side from where I drove in? He says, no, this is it. He says, I think they had just 3,000 people within a 35-mile drive in any direction, something like. It's just farms. It's just everybody living at a distance from each other. It's just this, rural area, right? And he goes, well, that's actually part of my story. I said, tell me about it. He said, you were talking about narrowing it down to a single thing you do. I go, yeah. He says, that's what I did several years ago. He said, I've been here 6 years. And 4 years ago, I was sitting at yet another funeral reception. He said, and I thought, all I'm doing is burying people. It was almost weekly. I'm literally presiding over the death of a church, one funeral at a time. And I'm at yet another funeral reception, and I'm sitting there, Lord, why am I here? What have you sent me here for? I'm in this tiny little church. The only thing we're good at is holding funeral receptions. And he said, we're good at this. We're good at this. And he said, I went to the funeral director and I said, here's the deal. From this point on, anybody who comes in for a funeral in this general region of Kurtz, Indiana, you tell them that Kurtz Nazarene Church will, for free, give them a funeral reception. We will feed any amount of people anywhere they want it. We will show up. We will set up. We will serve them. We will clean up. We will get out of their way. We will not charge them a penny. We will not ask anything of them. We will give a grieving family one less thing to worry about on the day that they bury their loved one. We will do that for this community. And he took them up on it. And he said, since then, we have done that for every single funeral in this region, and we have touched every single family in the region of Kurtz, Indiana. And then he said, actually, I'm going to have to clear out my office this week. We're standing at his office. I go, you're not leaving, are you? He goes, no, I guess got to move my office out. There's a janitor's closet down at the end of the thing. I'm going to move into there instead. I said, why are you doing that? He says, well, as you can see, this is the only room in the church where you can look in and you can see the sanctuary, tiny little sanctuary. I go, yeah. He goes, we have to turn this into a nursery because for the first time in over a decade, we have babies. Church growth through funeral receptions. Can be the title of my next book. That's what he looked around and he went, what do we do well? I mean, if Kurtz Nazarene Church can take the literal dying of their congregation members and turn it into a missions opportunity to the community, then there's something your church does well or can do well that the Lord can use to bless your community and to see health return to your church. If they can use that, you know it's possible. So let's take a look at some of these things. First of all, one of the challenges that we have is we have I believe in our culture, we have an overemphasis on the office of pastor. And it's not that we should pastor less, and certainly none of us can pastor any harder than we're doing it, but I do think we can pastor more biblically. So let's take a look at this. Oh, there we go with that again. Okay. I call it the pastoral prime mandate. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. To equip God's people for works of service. Several years ago, I thought I was doing this teaching on pastoring, and I thought I need to, take a look at, I'm going to do a deep dive into what the Bible says about pastoring. So I got out my Bible software and I put in the word pastor and came up with 0 results. I put in pastoring and got 0 results. Put in pastors and got 1 result. And I only discovered like 10 years ago what I should have known my whole life, that the word pastor gets 1 mention in the entire New Testament. And if you use the APEST acronym, we don't even get a mention there. It changes to shepherd. Ephesians 4, 11 and 12 it talks about the pastors. The only place where the word pastor is mentioned, pastors, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors and teachers, or shepherds and teachers, right, depending on your translation. So pastors, we get 1 mention in the New Testament, and in that one place where we get a mention, we have to share the spotlight with 4 other ministry gifts. I'm going to stay over here. That happened last time I moved over there. Not going to move, right? Right? And in that place, the only place we're mentioned, that we have to share the spotlight with 4 others, we are given one and only one task, and it is to equip God's people for works of service. We are not called to do the ministry for people. Here's the deal. Most pastors, we're not pastoring our churches, we're chaplaining our churches.
That's right.
Now, I'm going to way overgeneralize the important, significant role of chaplains. Chaplains do God's own work. They do extraordinary work. But I'm going to oversimplify what they do for the purpose of this. The primary difference between pastors and chaplains is this. Chaplains bring ministry to people and do ministry for people. Pastors are called to equip God's people to do the ministry. Chaplains bring ministry to prisons, bring ministry to hospitals, bring ministry, right? They bring ministry to the military, okay? They bring it to them and do it for them. That's their job. That's their calling. That is an awesome thing that they do in many forgotten places. I value them highly. But too many of us are trying to chaplain our churches by doing all the ministry for them and bringing all the ministry to them. And we're going to burn ourselves out, and we're going to turn them into passive members. So I call it the pastoral prime mandate because it's the only job we're given. The only place we're mentioned, we're only given one job. Now, I get it. There's other words. There's presbyters, there's elders, there's bishops, and all of those come into the role. I understand all that, right? But the word pastor itself, which is the word we always use, has the one thing in that we're given that one job. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the 3 fundamental elements of what it means to be a healthy and effective church, finally getting to the answering your question from earlier, right? This is how do we define a healthy or effective church? Here they are. The Great Commandment, the Great Commission, and now equipping God's people. Let's take a look at how it usually develops. Some of us, I've been called 3 times now to churches that weren't doing any of them, right? They weren't doing the Great Commandment. They barely loved God, and they couldn't even tolerate each other. They weren't reaching out to the community, and nobody was training anybody, right? And some of us are called to fix a church like that. And when you go to that is the definition right there of an unhealthy church. They're not doing any of the 3. So first thing we do is we step up and we teach them how to do the Great Commandment, how to love God and love each other. What did I tell you when I showed up at my church 29 years ago? What did we do for the first 7 years? Worship services and potluck fellowships so we could figure out how to love God and love each other again. Great Commandment. That's all we did for the first 7 years, Great Commandment. And then at the end of the 7 years, we looked around and go, well, we need to bring people in. So what are we going to do? We're going to do the Great Commission. We're going to reach out to the community, okay? So if you have the Great Commandment and only a Great Commandment, you have a loving but ineffective church. Some of you may have a church and go, I don't know why people aren't here. Everybody loves each other. The sense of worship is wonderful. The sense of God's presence is great. Why isn't anybody showing up? Probably because you got the Great Commandment locked down, but the Great Commission has yet to kick in. Right? Without that, you have a loving but ineffective church. So we add the Great Commission to it. We start reaching out to the community. And in my story, right, we started reaching out. It started working. We grew up to 400. And then at that point, I and my entire staff were done. We were burned out. We needed to hire a whole bunch more people. Why? Because we were doing the Great Commandment. We were loving God and loving others. We were doing the Great Commission. We were reaching out, but only the staff was doing it. And if you only do those two, you will have overworked pastors and passive members. And there are too many of our churches where the pastors are burning themselves out doing all the ministry, doing all the work. When I discovered this, I went to our congregation and I went to them regularly for a couple of years and told them, it is not my job to do the ministry for you. It is my calling from God to train you to do the work of ministry. And I'm going to do that for you, and I'm going to do that with you. Let's get on board. And when they hear that and they have it outlined for them, you'd be amazed how people will step up when it's framed properly for them and biblically for them. They want to be involved. Like I said earlier, if you do it for them, they'll let you, but that's not good for anybody. You have overworked pastors and passive members. So when we add that third element, equipping God's people, discipleship changes everything. You realize when you disciple people who become disciple makers, you won't need as much money because you don't have to hire everybody all the time. You got a whole bunch of free people who do it for free. Plus, the people who have been discipled and who are active in ministry tend to tithe more as well. So even your budgetary problems get fixed with discipleship. You're doing too much. You're burning yourself up, burning yourself out, candle on both ends. Discipleship will fix your home life and your schedule because you'll have more people who can step up and do those things, and it's not going to all be on you. Now, getting there is slow and tedious, and it takes time, and it's going to be filled with a whole bunch of people that you pour a whole bunch of stuff into, and then they abandon the whole thing, and you got to start again with someone else. Happened over and over and over again. You know, I gave you the success story of me to Gary to Andrew, to Joey, but I got a whole bunch that just, stopped, dead end roads. I got a whole bunch of those in my past too. But that's okay, you just keep going. When you equip God's people, then you add all those three together. That's what a healthy and effective church looks like. Are we loving God? Yes. Are we showing it in demonstrable ways? Yes. Are we loving each other and showing it in demonstrable ways? Yes. Are we reaching out to our community? Do people want to invite their friends? Are they excited about their faith so that they're sharing it with their friends? Yes. Are people being equipped? Are they being discipled and becoming disciple makers themselves? You put all of that together, that's what a healthy and effective church looks like. That's what we need to be aiming for. Now, you can do all of that and not have the numbers to show for it. You can, for a whole bunch of reasons. Our church, in addition to doing the working from the church and not just in the church, we're also a sending church. We went through a long season where we kept losing people. And I finally went to the board because we were trying to figure out what we do well. And I said, hey, I went through the whole list of people who'd left recently, and they're like, why are you depressing us? I said, think about what they left for. This person left because they became a missionary. This person left because they were hired on staff at a church. This person left because they're working at a Christian campground. This person left because they're going to Bible college to become training for a minister. We're losing people because we've trained them up, and they are now going off and doing the work of ministry. We are putting seeds out into the kingdom of God. Most of them aren't going to come back here for all kinds of reasons. And I said, here's the deal. We were trying to figure out what we do well. I think we do this well. We train people up when we send them out. I said, now we need to figure out how to do it on purpose, which we'll get to in a moment. So there's an old story about a guy who's walking around a farm. And he comes around the side of a barn, and an archer is there, and he's been shooting arrows into the side of the barn. And as he looks at the barn, there's 5 different targets. And there's an arrow dead center of each of the targets. Wow. Dead center of each of the targets. That wasn't even me. I'm not moving from this spot. I'll just preach like this from now on. And there's an arrow in each center of each target. He looks at the archer and goes, wow, how'd you get to be such a good shot? And the archer doesn't say anything. He goes over, he pulls all the 5 arrows, he puts them in his quiver, walks around. There's nothing on that side of the barn at all, just a door. 5 times he aims for the door, 5 times he misses in 5 random spots. But the archer isn't upset at all. Instead, he goes over to the barn, he finds a can of paint, picks it up, and paints a target around where each arrow hit. Now, that's an old story, but I can feel it just about coming out to jump at me now. Now I'm just sitting up here all nervous. Everybody else in the room, like, yeah, I can hear the hum. Yeah. Should I just go real close so you can turn it down a little? Is that the best way for me to go? If I just go like this and then you turn my mic down so it's good. All right. So if I want you to imagine that instead of shooting 5 arrows, he shot 100 arrows. What you're going to discover is that arrows tend to clump. Maybe 50 of them still hit randomly, but 25 of them kind of hit a whole lot over here, and 25 of them kind of hit a whole lot over here. Well, here's the deal. If that happens, put a big old target around where you're hitting already. So how does this work for church? Here's what we do. start shooting arrows. Just do the stuff that every church is supposed to do. Do the Jesus stuff, okay? Do what you know to do. What does Jesus say to do? Love God, love others, serve your community, find a need and fill it. Just do the stuff you know you're supposed to do. But now from this point on, pay attention to what works and why. Pay attention to where your arrows start clumping. You may try something, that didn't work, that worked, that didn't work, that worked, that worked, that worked, that didn't work. Now take a look at all the stuff that did work and ask, what do they have in common? See, I'm not telling you, go down and see what the latest trend is, see what the cool church across town is doing. No, figure out what's already in your DNA. What do you do well? And when you put them all together, do they have something in common? And when you find the common thread, like for us it was, we're Ascending Church, it turns out. We didn't even know it. We were already doing it. And if we're doing it by mistake, what would happen if we did it on purpose? So that's the next step. After you discover what your church does well, do it on purpose. So do what you know to do. Shoot arrows. Do the Jesus stuff. Pay attention to what works and why it works. And then if you've been doing it well by mistake, now do it on purpose and see what the Lord can do when that happens. If you don't know what to do, experiment, try new stuff, but pay attention to the common threads of why it's working. And then after you figure out what's working and you're doing it on purpose, then front load the value. Feature what you do well. There's too many churches that we do something well and nobody knows about it. Here's a great example from a tiny little town in Ione, California. Northern California, Ione, tiny little town up in the woods at hunting country. And there's a state penitentiary for men right next to the town, and there are more men in the penitentiary than there are people in the town of Ione. The people in the town of Ione call them our friends in the gated community. I love that. And there's a pastor there, Dan Epperson, and he realized years ago we have to do something and we have to do it well. We don't know what it is. And he realized there were all these kids running through the town and making a mess of stuff, what we used to call juvenile delinquents, right? And no, he didn't set up a skateboard park because that wasn't what they needed in Ione. The kids were there because dad was in the prison and mom moved there to be near dad, but mom didn't have any way to make a living and the kids didn't have anything. And so instead of going to the moms or the kids and finding out how can we help you, they went to the teachers and said, how can we help you help the kids? And the teachers said almost unanimously, the kids need backpacks. They don't have any money, they got nothing. They come to school, we give them books. The books either get lost or destroyed because they don't have a backpack to carry them home in. So they did a backpack drive. They got a hold of a group called Rural Compassion, and Rural Compassion came in with a truckload of backpacks for them, and they gave a big festival, gave backpacks away. And then as winter came, they gave snow boots away. And 3-4 times a year now, they do these big festivals where they bring them in and they give this stuff away to these kids in town. And these kids, once dad is out of prison, will leave. They're not going to put more butts in the seats through this, but they are going to minister to the people who really need it. And they do it over and over again. And they have now called themselves the church that cares for kids. If you go to Ione, California today and walk into an average store and ask them, where's Kingsview Assembly of God? Almost nobody will know what you're talking about. But if you ask them, where's the church that cares for kids? Almost everybody in town will go, oh, it's down over there. If you go to their website, you go to their Facebook page, you'll see a picture of the church, but it's usually behind like a bounce house or something and a big old banner saying the church that cares for kids. That's what they do. And they tell everybody, you come to this church. If you're a senior, if you're a teenager, if you're a mom and dad, if you're a young married couple, if you're not about ministry to kids, you probably ought to find another church because that's all we do here. Now, I know some people are going to think, really? Or what about everybody else? Well, they say, this is the way they put it. Every kid needs older siblings. Every kid needs parent figures. Every kid needs grandparent figures. So it doesn't matter what your age you are, you can fit into the life of a child in this church. But that's what we're all about. And again, somebody might say, but really just the one thing? Yeah, here's the deal. They used to do nothing well. They tried to do everything and didn't do any of it well. And now they found one thing and they do it awesome. I'm good to go. And the more time goes along, the more even the communities around us are going to be not just okay with that, but are going to celebrate that. That's not the church that has awesome Bible studies necessarily. It's not the one that puts on big musical events. It's not the one who has whatever. They care for kids, that's it. But boy, do they. So now what happens is when people around the community who also share their burden for kids want to help out, they know it's going to filter through Ione Assembly of God. They know that that's where it's going to come from because they're the church that cares for kids. And they discovered a need and they filled it. So whether it's the Kurtz, Indiana example, where they saw what they thought was a weakness and turned it into a strength, or whether it's the Ione, California example where they saw a need in the community and said, we're just going to step up and do it. You figure it out, you do what God says, and then you front load it, you feature it, you let everybody know. Now, the big question that comes in after that is, okay, so how then, if we're going to narrow it down to one thing we do well, how do we talk to the people in the church who are doing stuff that they've loved for years that has been producing no fruit whatsoever? How do we say no to ministries that used to be good and are still loved by some people? So let me walk you through that. It will not be easy, but there is a plan. You got to do something called the closet rule. People who live in really big cities with massive rents and tiny closets have something they call the closet rule. And the closet rule is simply this: we don't put in a new garment until we've taken out an old garment. Just what you got to do when you're crowded. I told this a few years ago at a conference like this, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, my wife has the same thing, only she calls it the RV rule. I'm not allowed to buy a new toy until I take out an old toy. It's exactly the same thing, right? Because they're limited space. So what do we do? Closet rule for ministries: don't add a new one until you've dropped an old one. And some of our churches need a 2-for-1 sale. Right? I used to come to conferences like this, and I'd go, let's do this, and I kept adding to the closet, and I was overstuffing the closet. And when I stripped it all out and said, we're just doing this, here's an example. A couple years ago, had our children's ministries director come to us at the beginning of summer. She said, by the end of summer, I'm not going to be able to do this anymore. And she said, I just want to give you the summer so you can prepare for it. So I said, okay. And I looked at her, and we had nobody. She hadn't trained anybody yet. This was several years ago before we were really doing discipleship well. But we had an internship program at the time, and we knew we had an 18-year-old girl who was coming in who wanted to do children's ministry. She'd never really done it before, but that was where her heart was. And so she was coming to a Bible college nearby, and she was going to intern at our church. And so I thought, okay, I got to figure out how to make this thing that can be run by an 18-year-old girl who's never done it before, because that's all I got on my Apollo 13 table, right? So I looked at what we did. I sat down and I wrote, what do we do? And I wrote, there were 5 things: Sunday morning, Wednesday night, VBS, 2 other things. Okay, we do 5 things. And then I put them in order of priority. What's the most important? Sunday morning, and then the order of list. And then I looked at them and I asked myself, what would happen if we stopped doing all of those and only did the one thing we do best, the one thing that's most important? So then I went to the 2 people who helped her in kids ministry, neither of whom were equipped for or wanted to step up in leadership. And I said, what if we did that? They looked at me and said, are we allowed to? I said, well, I'm the pastor and I'm suggesting it, so I'm guessing, yeah, we're allowed to. And they both said, oh, that'd be awesome. So they said, so like all the time we're putting into 5 things, we can put into 1 thing? Yeah. All the creative ideas that we have to come up with and have to divide among 5 things, we can put into 1 thing? Yeah. All the time? Yeah. Oh, that'd be great. And sure enough, that's what we did. And still now, this is almost 5 years ago, that's still all we do for kids. We did a VBS last year to see if it would work, post-pandemic, and we're not going to do it the next couple of years. It didn't. We still just do 1 thing for kids. That's it. But we do it so much better than we used to. Now, when will we add other things? When our closet gets bigger. When we have more workers, or we have more funds, or we have more kids. When we have more need, when the need changes, and Sunday morning isn't as big a need as Wednesday night, whatever. We're ready to adapt, we're ready to change, but we narrowed it down to 1. See, in a big church, when you're doing 5 different things for kids department, you have a different leadership group at all 5 times. But in a small group, it's the same people doing it all 5 times. And we're wearing people out. So we got to simplify. That's why we did a closet rule. We've got to start doing now. How do we start deciding what to drop and what to keep? That's the challenge. Here's the starting place. We got to ask these questions. What do you do well that you'd like to do more of? And what do you do poorly that you'd like to do less of? Start with that question. That's not the end question, but that's a starter question. If you don't start there, you're not going to get where you need to go. What do we do well? What are we already doing well? Not what's the latest trend, what's the cool thing. No, look at our own DNA. What do we already do well? What if we did more of that? And what if we took all the resources that we're putting into stuff that we don't do well and do like the Dave Ramsey, debt payment snowball, right? Let's pay off the small ones. Stop putting resources in here. And as we drop each one of them, put the same resources into this. This gets more resources. There's less dispersion of all the resources. We get to do it better. We get better ideas. We get more people. We get more funds. Everything goes into that. So we don't start with what do we like, what we don't like. We start with what do we do well and what do we do poorly. Now, to get there, let me tell you how we got there, and we're just about at the end of this. We need to move out of what I call a destination mindset and into a process orientation. I want you to imagine that you want to run a marathon, and so you decide that there's a high school next to you, and there's a quarter-mile track behind the high school. So you get out there and you buy all of your new running gear, and you think you're going to tackle this. And you get out there and you do that. You do once around the quarter-mile oval, and at the end of the 1 quarter mile, you're like, I didn't know this was going to be this hard. But the next morning you get up and you're determined and you're going to do it again. And the next time you're not breathing quite so hard. And at the end of the week, you're doing it twice. And at the end of a month, you're doing it 5, 6, 7 times. And a few months go by, and before you know it, you are just doing this every single day. And you are, now, take a look at what I'm doing here with my hand. See what this is? This is a process. And a process has 2 elements. It has motion and it has consistency. I'm moving, but you know where I'm going to move. I'm consistent, but I'm not stuck. I'm moving towards something, right? I'm building up my resilience to run a marathon. This process will get me ready for a marathon. Motion and consistency. Most of the time in churches, we've got a destination mindset. So here's what we do typically when I want to start a church, so I'm going to either find a building or find a piece of land to build a building on. We're going to build a building, we're going to put the denominational sign on there, we're going to lock the chairs in place, we're going to get a big old pulpit with a plaque on the side that says, don't you dare get rid of this pulpit until every single person in the family that donated it has died. Right? This is the old school way of doing it, right? And then we put hymnals in there, and then it took so much effort to get there, and it's finally built, and it's finally set in place, and we go, and we're tired. And so when we get to the destination, what do? We stop moving. People arrive at a destination. That's why they call them settlers, because they settled. They stopped moving. And then the community around us changes. And 10 years goes by, 20 years goes by. We're still doing the same thing because we think it's working, because it's working for us, because we like it. And we go around, why aren't we touching the community anymore? Because they've moved on for the last 20 years, and you haven't even dusted the fake plants on your stage. I know, I've been in some of the churches. All right? So what do we need to do? Move out of that destination mindset, arrive here and stay here, to a process orientation, a process. Let me describe you our church's process. Our church's process is very simple. We are always improving our least effective ministry, and we're always improving the least effective part of our building. That's our whole process. So you take a look down, what's our least effective ministry right now? At that time, it was children's ministry. We're going to improve it. After we improved it, we then looked at the building and said, what do we need to improve about the building to go along with the improvements we've made in children's ministry? And we improved the building. And then we looked around and said, now what's the least effective ministry? It's that, okay, we're going to fix that. Now what's the least effective part of our building? We're going to fix that. Everybody in our church knows there will always be a ministry under construction, and there will always be a part of the building under construction. Always. So people become averse to change because they don't experience it enough, and they don't have a process that helps them understand it. But a process, constant motion, but consistency. Our process is constant motion, but it's consistent. They know what we're going to change and why, because we have a reason behind it. So out of a destination mindset into a process. See, here's the deal. We think churches can't handle change, but they can. Churches can handle change. They just don't like to be surprised. What we do is we don't change anything for a long period of time, right? He just got me relaxed. Like I'm blaming you. It's not your fault, right? It just, right? And we get, where was I? Okay. Right, churches can handle change. They don't like to be surprised. So we don't change anything for a long time. Then we go to a conference and we want to change everything. Yeah. And change looks like this. And then people go, no. And we think they don't like change. No, they just don't like the way you're doing it. If you've got a process, people will go with you if they understand the why, if they understand the process. We don't have an issue with that at our church. They understand the process. We just do this all the time. Oh, okay, I understand that process. And if they come in new and they don't buy into it and they want it to be only exact, I tell them that in the leadership, in the membership class. If you are determined that you're here only because the skate park, or because we sing those songs, or because we do youth ministry in that way, or because we do seniors ministry in that way, then you may want to find another church, because it's going to change, and soon. I don't know what it's going to change to, because we haven't hit that time yet, but everything is changeable except for the essentials of the gospel. Everything else is going to be changed. If this is why you're attending, you're going to get upset at some point. But if you're good with a church constantly updating so that we can stay ready for it, preaching the gospel to people, we're going to do that. Just don't surprise them. And one of the best ways to not surprise them is this: give the leaders time to ponder big decisions. When I first came to the church, 5 pastors in the previous 10 years, that had a lot of change. And they say, every pastor who's come in has had a big vision, a big idea. And we get that you're going to have your own ideas too, but most of them have just gone out and done stuff and haven't even explained why or told us what's going on. This is the leadership, the deacon board. And they said, we want to be behind you. We want to support our pastor. We really do. Just please dial us in on the process so we can do what we're supposed to do as deacons. And I thought, that's a reasonable request. So there's a lot of requests from deacon boards that aren't. That one was. So I said, here's my promise to you. If I have a big decision that has to be made, I will not bring it up and ask for your final answer in the same meeting. I will give you at least one meeting's advance notice to think and to pray and ponder about it before you have to make a decision. So as an example, at about the 7-year point when we said we got a healthy church, we got to change it, we got to reach the people, one of the things we realized was we had a church name that was hurting us because it was tied to the old reputation of the church. We had to update our church name. So I brought this to the board and I said, okay, big idea time. Here's the rule. I'm going to present it to you. We're going to pray about it. We're not going to talk about it. You're not going to talk to each other about it. You're just going to take it home and pray about it until the next meeting. That's how we did it. So I presented it. I think we need to change the church name. Here's why. Okay. We leave, come back next month to the deacon meeting. And at the end of the meeting, I present it again and I go, okay, what have you thought and prayed about since then? And the longest serving, most respected member of the board spoke up and said, Pastor, I heard what you said last time. And my first thought is, you're not changing the name of my church. And I thought, oh boy. And he goes, but my wife and I, we went on vacation since the last time. I said, yeah, I know. I saw you were gone a couple Sundays. He said, we went to such and such, yeah. He said, so on Sunday, we're trying to figure out what church to go to. And, she's looking through the list of churches, and she names one church, and she goes, how about this church? And I went, it sounds like some dry, boring old church. And she went, Al, that's exactly the same name as our church. Now, how did he not recognize the name of the church? Because we went by initials, right? It was just one, right? Some churches, they just go by initials. I go to CBC, I go to LTUF or whatever. And he'd been there so long, he'd forgotten the actual name of the church. It was just CBC, right? And it was another church, exactly the same name. And he went, I realized at that point, that's how people see our church. We got to change our church name. And I went, I gave the Holy Spirit a month and he took care of my problem for me. I didn't have to argue. See, if I had even asked, hey, any responses when I'd first presented it, he would have been the first person to speak up and he'd have gone, nobody's changing the name of my church. And it would have been dead in the water because nobody was going to buck him. He was the oldest, longest serving, most respected member of the board. I just let it go. I said, Lord, you do to him what you did to me. Because here's the deal. By the time I was ready to bring it up, I'd been struggling and praying and thinking about it for months. All right, think about it. When you got a big idea, it roils around and you think about it. And then we present it to the group. And if they don't get on board in 20 minutes, we go, what's wrong with you? You're not ready for change? Give them more than 20 minutes. God gave you a lot more than 20 minutes. Give them more than 20 minutes. If you give people the respect of time, they'll come along way more often than we think. Way more often than we think. But we've got to give them the respect of time. Now, in case you're wondering, I know that story sounds like one of those pastor stories that are made up because there's no way this guy forgot his church name, right? So I'm just to confirm it with you. I wrote this in Small Church Essentials. And my editor at Moody, after reading it, emailed me back and said, book's great, just got one question. That story about that guy who forgot the church name, did that really happen? Yes, it really happened. He said, can you get a hold of him? I went, yeah, he still goes to the church. I go, perfect. Can you just take what you wrote for the book, write it in a letter form where he and you can sign it on the bottom that it's true? So I said, yeah, I can do that. So I wrote it up, exact words from the book, had Al sign it, I signed it, we sent it back in. So today at Moody headquarters in Chicago, Illinois, there is a file cabinet with a file folder with a piece of paper and it's signed by the guy that actually happened to, that it's true. Just so you know, just in case you're wondering, that's a bit too odd. That actually happened. So let me finish up with this. Stephen Ambrose is a guy who's written a lot about World War II. He's probably most famous for writing this book, Band of Brothers. And he also wrote a book about D-Day called D-Day. It's about this thick. A friend of mine gave it to me, and he said, I know this is a thick book. He says, I just want you to read one chapter, and he gave me the chapter number. And in it was this story. World War II. Stephen Ambrose was doing some research about D-Day back in the 60s when he was a young reporter, and he had a chance to interview Dwight Eisenhower. So he interviewed Eisenhower, and after he finished interviewing Eisenhower about D-Day, Eisenhower said, "Where are you heading to next?" He said, "I'm going to Nolans. I'm going to New Orleans." He said, "Oh, are you going to talk to Andrew Jackson Higgins?" And he said, "Oh, I wish I could, but Higgins died just a few months ago." He said, "Oh, that's too bad. Andrew Jackson Higgins won World War II for us." Okay. Who? Yeah, exactly. And this is Dwight Eisenhower saying Andrew Jackson Higgins won World War II for us. And who is Andrew Jackson Higgins? So he said, I thought I knew his story, so I figured I got to get into the story a little more. Andrew Jackson Higgins was a boat builder in New Orleans. And he had an idea for a small boat that he thought the Navy could use. So he brought his plans to the Navy, and the Department of the Navy said, no, we can't use that. He said, I think you're going to need it. And they said, no. He brought it to them again. They said, stop bugging us. We don't need it. We got to get across the Atlantic, the Pacific, the English Channel. These are rough waters. We can't use tiny little boats. It's ridiculous. Stop bringing this to us. He said, I think you're going to need it. We don't need it. Well, as D-Day is getting closer and closer, they start realizing the battleships and destroyers, wow, it's really getting... I'm going to hand this away and just turn it off because I'm too nervous to just turn off the mic because I'm still on this for the recording, right? Okay, just the one last story. I can do this without that. I can move now too. I was frozen in place. Concrete was gathering around my feet. So, boat builder, New Orleans. And he said, I think you're going to need it. So as D-Day is getting closer, they realize the destroyers and the battleships are going to get the troops to about a mile off the beach. And in order to get them all off of the destroyers and battleships onto the beach, they're going to need a whole bunch of small boats. But D-Day is getting closer. It has a real tight window. And they don't have small boats yet, and they don't know how to get them. So they did something unprecedented. They sent letters to every boat builder in the country and said, we need a small landing craft. Does anybody have any ideas? And Andrew Jackson Higgins goes, And he shows them their plans, and they go, it's perfect. He goes, I know. I've been trying to tell you for a couple of years. And then they say, but I don't know if we can do this in time. It's so tight. Are you going to be able to do this? He says, no problem. I've already begun to retrofit all of my factories to make these. I've ordered most of the supplies because I knew you would need them. Dude! Like that's mic, if I had the mic, right? That's a mic drop right there. You did what? Yeah, it's in the story, right? And so he did. Now, if you've ever seen a D-Day movie, like the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, you know the boat. Flat bottom, flat sides, flat front, 20 to 40 troops in them, right? They go in, they hit the beach, the front of that boat drops down, and a bunch of boys run into hell on earth and save the world. I mean, phrases like that are an exaggeration almost every other time. It's not an exaggeration for that day. They saved the world by running into hell on earth. And more boots were put on the sand that day through that boat. They called them the Higgins boat. The Navy gave it a weird, name with random numbers and letters. But nobody ever called them anything other than a Higgins boat after Andrew Jackson Higgins, who knew in advance that they'd need it, who said, I don't care what you think you need or you don't need, you're going to need this. And so on that day, I want you to imagine that you're the commander of one of those landing craft on the Higgins boat. And you're sitting there and you're getting closer and the shots are coming. And you know you're about to be in a bad, bad place. And maybe you're looking around and going, man, I wish I was a captain of a destroyer. I'd be better than that guy. I hear the admiral's back on that battleship. I wish I was an admiral. So I'm stuck here on this stupid Higgins boat and everybody's shooting at me. But you know what? The Higgins boat commander could do something that day that the captain, the admiral, couldn't do. Because before they got on their boat that day, he went around to all the troops under his command and he said, I want your letters to home. And he gathered those letters and he wrote one of his own and he put them in his box, strong box by his bunk. And if he survived the day, he went back at the end of the day and he picked out that strong box and he gave the letters back to those who survived, usually only about half. And to the other people, he took those letters, and the commander of the Higgins boat could do something that the admiral and the captain could not do. he could add his personal note that says, I knew your brother, your son, your father, your husband. I fought next to him. He showed me your picture all the time. I'll never forget his laugh. He talked about the time you guys went apple picking that time. And I won't miss him as much as you do, but I will miss him, and I loved him too. And he died a hero. Thank you. We get to do that. That's what we get to do. I'm grateful for the captains and the admirals and the big ships. I am grateful for them. Because on that day, they needed the big ships to get them as close as they could. They needed the small landing craft. They needed parachurch ministries to fly, like the parachuters to come over and drop resources to them when they needed it. Just like this is dropping resources to you in the battlefield when you need it. We need everybody on this. We need the big, we need the small, we need the para, we need everybody on this. But don't you ever look at your role and think you don't have an important part to play. You are absolutely essential to the mission. We need everybody on this. Nothing less than the fate of the world is at stake here. The fate of souls for eternity is at stake here. And we get to do the boots on the ground in the mess with everybody. We get to do that. Don't ever look down on that again. Don't ever look down at yourself again. Don't ever look down at the role God has given you again. Without you, this can't be done. We need everybody. We need you. You are essential. Thank you.